Hello. I'll try not to knock the table today because I think I may have caused a glitch in my last video by knocking the table my camera's on. But anyway, what I wanted to say today is a bit more about schizophrenia in UK and housing situation, because as I said in previous videos, excuse me, I've talked about how I was diagnosed with schizophrenia many years ago when I was in my late 20s, and how I kept working with this until eventually things caught up with me and had to return to London after being situated in Vienna, Austria. And I've been talking all about the stigma, the hate, and some of the root causes of this condition. And many specialists, I think, cite housing problems as a cause of many mental health problems, including schizophrenia. And we have apparently currently a massive youth mental health problem, and especially during and since COVID. And I'm aware of one thing that brings to mind is our susceptibility when we're young to survivor's guilt. And it may be, I don't want to second guess other people and their condition, but it may just be an oversight for some, in some cases, where they, of course, would naturally have survivor's guilt, and that might be putting them a bit off centre in how they feel as a youth. But anyway, it certainly doesn't help to have this housing crisis, and where everyone's living, I don't know. But I'd just like to introduce this by saying that today I'm going to talk about my homelessness and how long term this situation's been going on. And I want to just say that bullying in the housing sector is the same as murder, effectively, because of course you cannot survive with no home. And it is as fatal as withdrawing food, to withdraw housing support, let's say, or to begrudge even minimal housing support. And this is obvious, but no one really in the press seems to be saying that this is a life or death situation, even though we have a colossal suicide rate in Britain at least. Anyway, so I'll talk a bit about my housing crisis. I've already talked about how bullied I am over my flat and how they just won't leave me alone on the subject, send me threatening letters, they just begrudge it for me, and this might shed light on why. So my housing crisis effectively started when I was at university in my early 20s. This was the London School of Slavonic and East European Studies, now part of University College London, but as such London University. When I was in my first year there, I paid to stay in halls of residence, which is what many students do. And it was extremely expensive, but I think it was obligatory even, but I was keen to get away from home, of course. I've discussed family problems and the difficulties there. And I think I've said how I spent my 2 gap years mostly abroad, in Moscow mainly, and also Greece and some time in Israel. But my base was still at the home of my divorcing parents. Clearly I couldn't have acquired, with the finances I had, I couldn't have acquired a property whilst abroad, so it was still my base. Anyway, so I was in these halls of residence, but it was a disaster, owing to the fact that I was woken up each night by kind of revellers, students coming in from the pub or wherever they'd been, drunkenly sort of behaving outside my room as though they were sort of in some Congo. It was a racket every night in the earliest hours of the morning or late enough. And any studious person aiming, as I had, to get a first with distinction, and luckily I did, by leaving the halls of residence, they will now know that this, you can't, yes, it was proved untenable to live there. And even though I didn't really want to live in my family home, I fled to my family home where I thought I'd stand a better chance, but this proved too difficult. And fortunately, I was lucky enough to have available, through a relative, a comparatively cheap flat in Hackney, even though there was no central heating and I had to use a baby bell as an oven. And so there was no central heating. It had 2 rooms, one with the baby belling for my whatever it's baby belling, I think, one of those miniature ovens. And I had no central heating, and it was difficult, but I managed to pay and get by in this flat. Luckily, it was nice and quiet for me usually. There were some rowdy neighbours at one point, but on the whole I was able to study there. Although I did have a problem with tree surgeons during my finals, but they stopped as soon as I complained. It was extremely unpleasant. But anyway, my final exams for university, hearing this racket when you've got an exam the next day or two. Anyway, so I stayed there until I finished my LSE master's degree. I've already said how I won 2 interlinked scholarships to do my MSc at the London School of Economics in Political Science. And I got 2 scholarships. One was, I think, an ESRC scholarship, and the other was a low-fee scholarship, so that the ESRC scholarship would cover my whole fees there. So I was okay, just about. Luckily, I'd managed to save up some money in the summer before going. It was a bit tight. Anyway, and during the holidays, while I was in this Hackney flat, I would go to Moscow and work there, and I also did some translation work, Russian to English translation work. Not much, but it was good money. So this was okay, and I also had a student loan, had a tiny amount of a grant paid towards my university studies, which is a bizarre system, who gets a grant, who doesn't. But anyway, I prefer a full loan system, which I think they now have. I think they scrapped grants altogether. I mean, I'm not talking much, I had several £100 maybe, or a few thousand, but I think on the whole I had I merged with £35,000 in debt back then, or 25, I'm not sure. Anyway, there is an interest rate that's not negligible, put it that way. But as you can imagine, as soon as my studies were over, I had to immediately go back to my parents until I'd found a job, and with this student loan over me also. And thankfully, I've now paid this off. Anyway, I applied for a journalistic job that fitted my credentials, which was advertised back then. This was in 1999, late 98 to 99, this ad came out. So I applied for this job in journalism, in business journalism, with a speciality in natural gas. And they wanted a graduate student for the job, and to train there as a journalist in the initial phase, and then to obviously work full-time. Well, it was full-time, it was a full-time job, I mean, not to be trained, initial training period, and then you would just be on your own with the journalism. Anyway, I applied for this job, and the amount they cited was okay money back then. It was £16,000 a year, subject to tax, of course. Anyway, the problem was I got to the interview, and the man interviewing me seemed keen, the editor seemed keen on me working there, but he lowered the salary as soon as I said I'd be keen on the job. He lowered it by enough to prevent me from renting, or especially as the tube fares were so high. The commute in London has been a major problem for many people. No matter how rich they are, they still have to commute from A to B usually, and have had to do this, especially back then. There wasn't that much in the way of working from home, even for a journalist. Anyway, the fares, if I recall back then, were £5 a day, and that's literally prohibited me with this salary of renting anywhere. And I certainly couldn't have purchased a property or taken out that amount of debt. Anyway, nevertheless, I had a promotion, but nevertheless, it was still very difficult to feel I could rent. So I've already discussed how I wanted to leave Britain owing to the poor quality of life in London, and the huge rents meant for very poor standard accommodation, and sorry, I've got a bit of a cold, and locked in contracts that would have left you in huge debt owing to the high price of the rent. Anyway, this would have left you in huge debt, and although my chosen place to work was Vienna, had similar rental contracts, they were way lower in terms of financial risk because the rents were lower. Anyway, I had to sofa surf for a while when I was in London, and this was difficult. I was slapped by a man who was connected to my family while staying there, and just for making toast. He just suddenly came up and slapped me. This, amongst other reasons, was why I was in Vienna so long, although the main reason was, of course, my love of Austrian German, the Austrian German language. And I have many fond memories of Vienna, but I struggled, as I've said in previous videos, with seizures. And I was diagnosed with epilepsy in Vienna a few years after being diagnosed with schizophrenia. And although I had some bonuses, like a good quality of life, a good quality flat, and all that kind of thing, my seizures made the whole ordeal quite hellish. Although there were many happy times too, looking back, and at the time. And so I've said that owing to this ghastly virus I contracted in 2009, I had to suddenly return to London and had no choice to stay with a relative. There was nothing I could do about having. I had been planning to buy a home if I'd kept on with my career and not become too unwell. I would have bought maybe a small place in London and subletted it while I worked away from home, either as a journalist or to continue some role with the FCO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom. And I had said I've had a brief secondment in Vienna for the FCO, which I enjoyed a lot, and they invited me back, but it was difficult for reasons of an unpredictability when my seizures emerged. It would just been difficult to say, yes, I'm sure I can do it at that point. And so anyway, I had to, I've told you how I was placed with a relative after emerging from a 2-month hospitalisation in a psychiatric ward under section and against my will. And there I was on all these medications, the anti-epileptics, folic acid to prevent further low platelets. It offsets one of the side effects of anti-epileptics, which was Keppra. And also I was on Zyprexa, which is the antipsychotic that suits me. And it was difficult. I had a lot of menstrual bleeding as a side effect, not of the Keppra, but of the folic acid, because I had an overdose of it, but I had no choice but to have this overdose, as far as I can understand my doctor's words, because I couldn't come off my anti-epileptic at that point. But I have now said my seizures, have now stabilised enough for me to be seizure-free and without the anticonvulsant, this anti-epileptic. I've said it was primary generalised epilepsy that I was diagnosed with under a video EEG. Anyway, so I had to live with this relative. And of course, for many years, even 5-6 years or something like that. And each time I tried to get information from various councils about my housing rights, they would verbally abuse me. And they would even say that, in letters, you would have to live anywhere in the country, which would mean I might have to live in Scotland, Wales, places I have no affiliation to. It's just absurd. They were horrific to me, and there were and are, I think, still 2 components to social housing. On the one hand, you could take a flat from a private landlord, so long as he would accept benefits, housing benefit. Or you could, as I have now, get a council property, which is what I wanted, and they were horrific to me about this. And you have to literally be on the streets to be classed as homeless. It's not enough to be with your parents, and the media has to define homelessness and temporary accommodation a bit more succinctly, because they show lovacious temporary properties when in fact it's a tiny room in a B&B for the homeless, a house share as such. It's not easy to enter temporary accommodation, even for several years, when it's literally just a tiny room for a whole family. Anyway, so those were and are, I think, still the 2 components to social housing. And you have to get, of course, a landlord to agree to someone on benefits. Now, I attempted the former for a year, shortly after I'd been placed with relative, and I got this flat. But of course, there's always a catch, isn't there? So what happened was the council would pay me I was eligible for housing benefit at the time, after filling in many forms, giving financial documents and that kind of thing. I also had, back then, I've sold them now, but I had a few shares, not many, but I had some shares that I had and I had to declare them also, of course. They gave me the money for the rent, which was back then, it would have been 2010, I think it was £950 for a 1-bedroom ground floor flat. I think it was £950 a month, as opposed to my current rent, which I think is about a bit short of £700 a month. So it's an extremely expensive system. Anyway, it'd go through my account, and then I'd have to send it to the landlord's account. But of course, nothing comes easily in this country. So I attempted this for a year under a contract that locked me in. And this abusive landlord would turn up, bang on my door, because I complained as soon as I got there that the boiler wasn't working properly. The gas safety engineer who came to do the initial inspection, which is mandatory in social housing, said that there was a problem with the heat exchanger, and this meant I had to live there through freezing winters with a radiator that would go on and off, barely working, and I was frozen. I couldn't nearly have hot baths some of the time. The water would go hot and cold, and just watch it. The boiler might seem to work, but check there's no problem with the heat exchanger is my advice in my lay opinion. Anyway, he refused to fix this, and there was also a flood from the upstairs flat that he got annoyed about, even though it wasn't my fault. And the council took his side when I tried to complain. They said, we think he's a very good landlord. Anyway, I survived this ordeal only by the fact that he had the keys to the also and tried to let himself in, but luckily the chain was up. Anyway, I survived only by the fact that a housing lawyer still existed back then, and they were able to do the exchange for me with the keys and stuff like that. They would give the keys back, and he would ring me up even after I left, harassing me on my mobile phone. Anyway, during this period, I was back at my relatives then, and looking to rent privately, because I had some savings. But even the property, I would like to point out, the rules have changed over savings. They've become more draconian, because you can't have as much savings now as back then, in terms of getting benefits. There's a means test. I don't think you can have anything above £16,000 for basic benefits to eat and drink, and then on top of that you have to apply for housing, and the housing department goes by the benefit you're on. So the two interrelated, and they dovetail their information, of course. Of course, I would like that to be more efficient in the way they exchange information through AI. Anyway, so I looked to rent privately, but even the property companies that the council listed as taking people on benefits all said no DSS, very rudely. They were it was like talking to a mad person. I said, the council has put you down as a company that will rent a flat with people on benefits, and they were just in no DSS. It was horrific. Anyway, eventually I had to move out from this relative's home. I used my savings to go to a budget hotel. After this relative I was staying with, I've already said I have family difficulties. This is a painful discussion for anyone who cares for animals as I have. I said that as a child I was brought up more or less by cats in terms of emotional support. Anyway, she euthanized my beloved cat Clive after he had become poorly, and she put human tablets into him, and I wouldn't say he wouldn't have died necessarily anyway, but I'm not sure if they caused him pain and suffering. I couldn't stay there any longer. It was going to be more and more horrors, more and more kind of emotional blackmail, more and more verbal abuse, more and more, and especially the coercive or control part of it. So I used my savings to stay in a hotel and tried to declare myself homeless at that point. Anyway, whenever you want legal advice in the UK, every single UK institute, even the police recently, recommends citizens' advice. But my experience is that they're not legally trained at all. They may not have any qualifications according to their website, except a few months, say several months training with the CAB itself, the Citizens Advice Bureau. I had to check eventually this individual was so bad at the job that I had to check whether she was actually a lawyer, and she wasn't listed as a solicitor or anything of that nature. The Law Society told me that. So my experience is that they're not legally trained at all, and do not know all the procedures for a housing crisis or homelessness. And these sort of lay individuals who may not have any much in the way of vetting or anything of that nature can gain access to your financial and health records. And they don't even like what they see when they get them. They challenge doctors and things like that and say, I didn't get that document. It was a process that was a waste of time, and it cost me a considerable amount of money. I believe what I should have done, looking back, is to have walked in to the housing authority and queued, but I didn't know that part of the procedure. Anyway, as such, I was left out of pocket by quite a lot, as this discussion with this lay advisor went on, and letters to and fro through the post, and very little happened. I remember her saying, cross fingers, when I write a letter, sometimes you can be successful. She was talking about my life. I would have been on the streets, and just sort of, didn't care at all. And as such, I get incensed by people recommending citizens' advice as though they're anything qualified. I don't know if it's a law that every single person has to recommend this charity, but isn't it unfair competition if every single person recommends them? And they say gleefully, I think at one point, 1/4 of our people, 25% are pleased with us. But what about the other 3/4? I think they were saying that on their website at one point. Anyway, I complained to various people about this whole thing, and the council. I was doing my best. But by some miracle, I managed to get the right form. It's a question of getting the right form to fill in. And I do not think this form was even available on the council website housing section. And anyway, I went into the building and a man there interviewed me. I think he may have been a housing lawyer. And during this long interview, I had to fill in quite a voluminous form and get various bits of information, which is not easy when you're in a hotel. Luckily, I had my computer and stuff like that. Anyway, I discussed with him how I came. Not everyone has that. Not everyone has spare cash. Not everyone has a computer. Not everyone even has a phone. Even I didn't at one point. Anyway, I discussed how I came to be homeless and the various family issues, and I've discussed some of these, not all, in previous videos. And I've also discussed, I put some links into these discussions in the description. I hope I remember to do that. How I was placed not in a flat or anywhere like that, despite being vulnerable and diagnosed with schizophrenia and a history of seizures. I was placed in a B&B for the homeless. Even though the plan was to take me off my anti-epileptic medication, I had to do this in those kinds of stressful circumstances. Potentially I could have had seizures in front of the dear poor children there. It would have been horrific had I had brain damage in that institute as a result of coming off my anti-epileptic. But luckily I had faith enough in God at that point to feel I could come off them. Anyway, 11 months in, I've talked about the life there, and how difficult it must have been for everyone. I assume it was. Finally, I got a letter 11 months in saying that a flat had become available. And I want to say this was after 11 months, but at this point I've seen recently on the Wandsworth Council website that even vulnerable people have to wait several years before they can be homed. Think logically, where are they? Meanwhile, where are these people? And I went to meet this council worker to get the flat. I had to meet her there to accept it. And I waited outside in the freezing winter ahead of Christmas. I think this was ahead of Christmas 2017. And they'd already cancelled my B&B for that night. And she was late, and I stood there and I thought, I'm going to be on the streets tonight. I didn't know what to do. And so I stood outside in the cold. And she came out of the building eventually. It was rude and surly and horrible, didn't apologise. Anyway, she took me into the flat, up the stairs of a bizarre building with ambulances going past. It was just by the hospital. And she took me into a miniature studio, literally miniature. And it had brown mould, an integrated heating system that was permanently on and you couldn't switch off, a broken hob, no oven, no bath, and a damaged shower unit which had a lavatory in there also. There was a fridge and a bed, and so I wouldn't have even built it. It was disgusting. I had to share a bed with the previous people, the same mattress as other people had laid on. There was no room for my belongings at all, and we say, there's not enough room to swing a cat, which I wouldn't do, but it was an unlawful property, to say the least. Anyway, the literature I had been given, and she also said that it was I had to sort of go by them to, ironically, even though I'm an energy specialist, I had to go to a comparison website to choose my energy provider to sort of mini dictate onto herself. Anyway, the literature given to me said that it advised me to accept the flat immediately and then dispute the accommodation. And anyway, as I was in this flat looking at it, this individual was already starting to blame me for this brown mould which was starting to appear before my very eyes. And I've discussed this brown mould. Well, the sheer extent to which properties are now covered in brown mould in Britain. Anyway, she said, "Oh, you have to wash it down in a bullying manner." And I didn't have a ladder to get up there. How am I going to get up to the top to the ceiling and things like that? It's absurd. Anyway, she said, "Just you've got to wipe it down." What's that meant to me? Wipe it down. Anyway, that night I noticed, in some state of terror, that over the shower room door, where the lavatory was inside also, a chain lock had been placed that meant if I was in the shower or in the lavatory, I'd have been locked in by anyone in there with me. And you have to understand how terrifying this is. It was a dungeon as such, because I couldn't even get post there. And I wrote to my GP back then, who was very nice all the time to me, and I wrote to someone I trusted and said what was happening. And I wrote to the post office also to say that I literally couldn't get bank statements, bank cards, anything there, private health information, anything. Anyway, I couldn't. Yes, as I say, and I couldn't ring because my phone contract at the time had suddenly changed its terms and conditions and become prohibitively expensive. Anyway, this individual kept turning up and leaving. She left a letter and she would ring saying, "Can you move a mattress with me?" And she had maybe a key to the very flimsy door. It wasn't a very good lock. I don't think I would have been insured there at all. It was horrific. And I was terrified. And so I did what anyone would do. As when she started to harass me on the phone and turn up, I told the police. I popped into a police station, unable really to use my phone for them. And they said I wanted to show them my phone with these calls. And I said I was terrified of her walking in and I'd have to defend myself at that point. And they said, as far as I can understand, that I had a right to defend myself from any intruder, anyone going in. But I was worried about this because I pointed out that this woman was pregnant. And it was very difficult. She'd come in with this lock over the door. And some people with epilepsy, like me, have to have some Valium on them just in case a seizure comes on. It's a quick fix if you feel one coming on. And I was very concerned that people were attracted to this bottle of Valium I had. Luckily, I don't need it anymore and I don't have it anymore. But it was horrible, the whole thing. And online it said that such locks were often there for coercive purposes to control women in particular or their children. Anyway, I had to spend vast amounts of my dwindling savings fighting a legal battle for a new, more appropriate flat in the area, and no lawyer would take my case. They said I have to first of all argue my case to them. Anyway, I learned they put me round in circles, refused to explain the complaints procedure. The counsellor they referred me eventually to the counsellor. The counsellor said, "I don't take complaints. You have to, at this point, you have to go back." I said, "I've been back." I went back and they just didn't do anything. The counsellor referred me back to the people I was complaining to about her. Anyway, having spent a lot of my savings at the last minute, I was awarded a more normal, this one-bedroom flat that I'm in here in Tooting. And it turned out that I'd been entitled all along because it's only people under 27 that have a studio. But you can't put a mother child or a father or a child in that kind of accommodation. It can't be lawful. It's horrific. And I wrote to the Home Office saying that this kind of parallel housing system had emerged, a kind of human trafficking ring. And we have had children go missing in a human trafficking ring here in Britain. It's been a little bit on the news, but not a lot. And I explained this to the then Home Secretary Amber Rudd, amongst other officials in senior positions in Britain. But I didn't expect actually much sympathy from this woman. I'm not saying the Home Office is directly related to housing, but it's related to safety in your own home. Anyway, as since this was the person, as far as if the press is correct, who said that only a mother could be Prime Minister. And that leaves how many little girls devastated. Anyway, I have discussed... this is Amber Rudd. Anyway, I have discussed how in my new flat, this flat that I got to eventually, how they are still doing all they can. I've been here some years now to make me frightened enough to leave and lying so they're going to hospital and then trying to deny me and thieving from me. Whoever set up this cleaning job thieving me. I discussed this. And say how they've liaised with health officials, rogue nurses that have been also in the press and rogue doctors. And to concoct racially loaded lies about me. I have said how they lied and said I defecated in my kitchen sink and ate my own excrement. And this is a lewd description of a woman that's simply untrue. Anyway, so I want to say a final word about this. I'm still being bullied. I still have people at my door. I still have the knock at the door. I still have trespassers. And every time I initiate a council complaint, someone's ringing at my buzzer. So I want to say one final word about this context. I had a council letter a few years after being here. This is something that doesn't get discussed much, the housing rules in the press. You need to be technically very precise with them, but I can speak from my own experiences. I had a council letter offering me a gigantic discount were I to purchase this council property. It belongs to the council. It was literally, I think it was as much as 30%, then 50%. And they said in the letter this entitlement would kick in after 3 years. I should like to express some logic here. How is this? Bear in mind we have a massive housing crisis, and they have on the website several years before you can get homed, even if you're vulnerable. How is this going to prevent poor workmanship or benefits fraud if that's the reward? How much is this flat worth in this bizarre housing history of London? 200,000, 300,000, 400,000. It's meant to go up 10% each year or something. You're going to have 500,000 in 5 years according to this hysteria. How's that going to prevent fraud? How's that meant to be fair for anyone? And I'll come on to this fairness issue in a short moment. And so why is it that cannot this shadow deputy PM, Angela Rayner, consider how people like me felt back then, as I've discussed, priced out of a rental system, fleeing abroad for a better quality of life? At the time, she has now been alleged to have been living in a council property that she then bought. Was this bought with this discount scheme? That has to be answered, this question. It seems to be the assumption that she bought an ex-council property, but that's not what it says. It says she purchased the council property that she'd been living with. And they've been focusing on the tax part, capital gains tax, but I should like more focus on the discount and the incentive there to do that. I don't know if she took a discount, I don't know all the circumstances, but there are many unanswered questions, and I should like answers, please. And was this a widespread phenomenon under Labour also? Because we all remember the Thatcher era policy of selling off council properties. Why was she in this flat? It was a council property. Spot the difference between Tory and Labour at this point. Was Labour offering these discounted schemes and right to buy under Labour, under Tony Blair? How many Labour MPs have done this? How many Labour MPs have used other people's taxes to build their own career and to have their family? A lot of people have opted out of motherhood or fatherhood precisely because of the housing situation. So I was paying towards her home, was I, when I was paying these taxes, because it was around the time that I was fleeing abroad because I couldn't get anything, even by rent, even by a normal rental contract with the securities. Of course, there's all this security in your council home. Everyone has the security. You're not meant to work at the same time as being in a council home, but why isn't that rule more clearly expressed also? I think you can do a tiny bit of work, but you certainly, I should imagine, could do a full-time job and be eligible. And this is in the context of everyone saying there are hardly any council properties left, and there's several years waiting. Where are the people on this waiting list? What is the definition of homeless? And it can't just be on the streets at night. It must be not having the means to rent or the right background to rent. Can't they speak a bit more logically, please, in the media? And can we not requisition these properties, either council or others, let's say, when the work effort or qualifications of those living in them and buying them did not necessarily fit that level of ownership? And what were Angela Rayner's qualifications, this Labour MP? I've seen online that her hard done by story seems to be linked to a mentally ill mum and a mentally ill brother, a psychotic mother and a psychotic brother. And that's her sort of hard luck story, is it? Bear in mind, I was doing the work, even with Schizophrenic, to pay for these council people to live in council properties. And what was her work? I read online that she was a carer for the council. There's not a conflict of interest there. She worked for the council, yet she had a council property. Can someone please answer these questions? Because they are looming larger and larger in society, as far as I can tell. I think it was the Russian gas, the late Rem Vahirov, who used to be CEO of Gazprom, who said, "Don't cry over spilled milk." And I don't know what he was predicting. I don't know. I didn't understand all the Russian or the context. Don't cry over spilled milk is all I say. Is she really proposing herself as a candidate, as a future Prime Minister? If she comes, if Keir Starmer to leave, is she really going to be the next PM, having built her career on other people's taxes and efforts? And why was it, if it was an ex-council property, that's maybe a temptation and a half, but it's even worse if you've actually sort of lived, stagnated in some council property and then conveniently have the discount ready at hand. And even if it wasn't the case back then, it certainly is the case now. Where's the incentive to work with a very poor level of accommodation, no ability to buy anything decent, if some people can just live in a council flat and buy it? I'm not saying everyone out there's lost. I think it's overrated how much fraud there is. I'm just stating the point that there's going to be a hell of a lot of jealousy. Can't you see that? Please just requisition properties from anyone. It sounds extremely too strict, but I have to say, if you haven't done your bit, why are you in the house? Why in a house when people who were funding that house in the first place and put you onto the property ladder for their own hard work and endeavour? Could the media not answer these questions a bit more clearly, please, or even address them at all? And yes, you can now see how I won't be voting either Tory or Labour come the July election. Thank you. So this is much food for thought, and I just want to point out you cannot expect no jealousy, and no jealousy, let's say, of overseas visitors who for somehow end up in a council flat having married in or something like that. You cannot possibly accept society to be normal with this going on. You keep going on about the housing shortage and the need to buy more, purchase and build more properties. But why aren't you considering the fact that housing is still being sold off in the social sector? Where are we meant to live? We paid our taxes for those people living in council flats, and I was happy to do it, I said at the time, to help them and their families have anywhere. Where are we meant to live? You have to make us a slave again or something. We live in where? Slums? And please think more carefully at this point about the next pandemic when you consider housing issues. Thank you.